So I'd like to move on and introduce our next speaker. Kate Bujue is the Executive Director for Advocacy and Research at Peak Care Queensland, the peak body for child protection. In 2023, she travelled around the world, visiting 6 countries as part of a Churchill Fellowship project, investigating best practice into youth crime prevention and therapeutic models of youth detention. Please welcome Kate. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this beautiful land that we're on, the Bundjalung people, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people with us today, especially those who work with young people in the youth justice system, so desperately overrepresented. And also extend my respect to the emerging elders that are sitting in youth detention centres as we speak. I must say that being invited to speak at this conference felt a bit funny, prevention, not detention, when I'm a youth detention practitioner, and that's kind of my topic. But I have to say to you that in my heart, I agree that no child should be locked up, that the abolition of youth detention for children is really, I think, our collective goal. But what I've seen in some places around the world is that youth detention centres can sometimes be places of healing and reconnection and rehabilitation, places where young people actually live better and stronger than when they came in. So what I want to share with you today is, what does it look like when those models are actually in existence, and they do exist today. But I think here in Australia, certainly in Queensland, we need to think about doing detention differently. So just a quick show of hands, has anybody been inside a youth detention centre? Quite a lot. I don't want to brag, but I've been to 25 youth detention centres now. I have seen just about every type of youth detention centre model that you could imagine. I've been to ones just so heartbreakingly awful, where young people have to be well behaved for weeks to get a tennis ball to throw against a wall. And yet I've also seen some pretty amazing places. So this is a youth detention centre. This one is in Spain. It's run by a charity, a non-government organisation called the Diagrama Foundation. So I was walking through this youth detention centre, which was established 35 years ago, and it was the first one that the Diagrama Foundation established. They now have centres all over Spain. They run more than 80% of Spain's youth detention. I saw groups of young people playing basketball alongside staff. I saw groups of young people cooking, using power tools, and I saw young people gardening alongside staff, working with animals, tending to gardens, doing pruning of olive trees. I saw a young man leave a building and run across the centre by himself without a staff member. He knocked on a door. A woman who was dressed in a chef's uniform came to the door. She gave him a little hug. They had a quick chat. He high-fived her and off he went again, back to the building he came from. I saw a family walk across the centre to one of the buildings where a young person and the family therapist were waiting on the balcony. They had a little hug and in they went for their family therapy session. After speaking to young people there, they talked a lot about the learning they were doing, the staff that were there, how much they were cared for. And when I finally drove away from that centre with the CEO of the organisation, he said to me, if one of your children ended up being told by the court that they had to spend some time in youth detention, would you be okay with your own child being here? And for the first time in my career, I was able to say yes. So my past 3 years, I was, before my role in advocacy now for a peak body, child protection peak body in Queensland, I spent 3 years in a senior leadership position in one of Queensland's youth detention centres. And this just blew my mind that I could have actually seen a place where I would be comfortable sending my own child. So if you don't know what a Churchill Fellowship is, it's an incredible opportunity based on the legacy of Winston Churchill, who said that, learning from other countries and what they're doing is incredibly important for a country. And so about 100 Australians go overseas every year. And you get to design your itinerary, you get to just say what topic you want to know more about. It's not an academic research, but if you use the QR code there, and I will share the PowerPoint later, you can access my research article. So it's an exploratory research model. So you really want to go and feel and understand what you want to know more about in other countries. These are the countries I chose because my original topic was actually youth gangs. I wanted to know how youth detention centres and how other countries prevent young people from entering youth gangs, which is very similar to how they prevent crime. A lot of my report talks about prevention, how youth detention centres safely manage young people in gangs, whether they separate them, whether they try to use restorative practices to resolve those relationships, and also then how they help young people leave gangs when they're ready to leave the gang. And I became really interested in the types of programs that they run with young people that include identity. Basically, identity work is the answer. It's replacing what a young person gets out of the gang, the genuine human needs that they're fulfilling, like a sense of belonging, like an identity that they've kind of received from that gang, and replacing it with other more pro-social ways to do that. And in fact, I'm now working with my partners in the Queensland African Communities Council, Multicultural Australia and Nurture Community Services to pilot a program, an identity program for young men from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds here in Queensland that I found on my research in London. We just want to see if it works here in Australia before we kind of roll that out more broadly. But while I was looking at the youth gang issue, and you can see lots of places on my itinerary that I've chosen because I know they have a long history of young people in gangs, I also found that some of the most incredible models of youth detention exist. And rather than picking one and saying, that's perfect, we need that, what I wanted to do was have a look at what the successful models have in common and what we can learn here in Australia. So what do I mean by therapeutic? I understand there are people, many people in this room who have, that's your core business and it's not mine, but I guess what I was really talking about here is not just places where young people are less likely to offend when they get out, but places that young people feel safe and are safe, where young people don't use violence, where staff want to work for their whole careers. And the ultimate goal, as I said, is that we have fewer young people in youth detention. So I had an incredible moment where I went to a youth detention centre in Polmont Youth Detention Centre in Glasgow, Scotland. The building was a long brick building with 300 beds in it, and they were all empty except two. And I got to have a game of pool with the last two young people under 18 years old that were in youth detention. It was announced in the media last week that they have now got 0 young people under 18 in youth detention centres. I'm very impressed by some of the statistics up there about lower recidivism, and I think that a therapeutic model of youth detention is one element to overall reducing the need for youth detention centres in the future. I have to say, though, that when you're talking about the Missouri model, which is in the USA and also close to home, which is New York City's approach, where they've taken young people from large youth detention centres and put them in small homes, actual houses dotted throughout the city. Those statistics are very impressive. However, there are still many young people in the States who are being trialled as adults and sent to adult facilities. So young people who use violence particularly, and some of those high-level felony crimes, they are not in those youth detention centres, they are in adult jails and they can be there for life. But the data there for Denmark and Spain includes all the young people with all of the offences. So what do they have in common? Well, I think that I've grouped it in my mind in two ways. There are the internal elements, which is what the work that happens within the youth detention centre and what the journey that a young person needs to go on internally to think differently about their crime and make different decisions. And then the other elements are the external elements and how young people are supported to rejoin their communities in a productive way. Therapy is very interesting, and it's taken differently in all of the places around the world. So the Missouri model has 4 levels that a young person goes through. You don't drop down a level for poor behaviour. You start on level 1 and you gradually progress your way through to level 4. What's interesting about the Missouri model is the court sentences a young person to a period of time in a youth detention centre, but doesn't say how long. So the working through these 4 levels, that's how long it takes you before you can get out. So you can imagine how motivated a young person might be to engage fully in the program if it means that once they're done, they're out. But it does also create a really lovely structure because there's a lot of certainty for young people, and so the photo on the left there is a therapy room which exists in every group of young people going through the Missouri model. They have levels 1 to 4 all together. And so up on the wall are these posters, and an example of a level 1 poster would be a young person comes in on level 1, their job is to sort of just learn the rules, start to exist in the group, understand the environment. They have a piece of paper on the wall that might say, you know, their name, the letters of their name and who they are. It's about who I am, my identity, pretty basic kind of therapeutic work being done in between group settings, and then they present to the group, you know, I'm Kate, this is who I am and this is where I come from. Then you've got a level 4 poster, a piece of work which might be a victim web, where you've got a picture of yourself in the middle, all of your victims. An example I saw on the wall was a young man who said, this is the man's life I took. These are the people in his life that his grandchildren will never know him. Pretty intense stuff to be presenting to your group and putting on a wall. Another one's called The Line of Body, where a young person had drawn a picture of himself and it said, this is my head where my stepdad hit me, and this is my leg which broke when my mum got drunk and I fell down the stairs as a baby. But I met a young man in level 1, and he said he'd come in and he sat in this group therapy room in the first couple of weeks, and he heard a level 4 presenting about his life and his background and the things that he'd been able to progress through therapeutically. And he said, I never knew anyone who also had these things in their life, ADHD and a mum who drank, and these things, you know, I was able to see where I was headed in terms of my work. So all of the successful elements in the world have got a therapeutic element, and the Diagramma model in Spain actually has about 80% of the staff there are degree qualified. They call them educators. They work alongside the young people. They're not security guards at all. The other 20% are kind of a bit further away from the action, and the educators are there working alongside them constantly and being mentors to them. So yeah, practicing the skills that young people need for when they reintegrate into society, very similar actually to the previous couple of presentations. Both mentioned things like practicing budgeting, practicing cooking, getting those kind of skills ready for when they get out. I'm a really big advocate for what's called a leave of absence, which is short periods of time that young people spend in the community while they're in detention. So I met a young man in Spain on Monday at lunchtime, and he'd been home for the weekend. He'd had a family visit that weekend. And he was back in the detention centre on Monday, and he told me that he had invited some friends over and they'd all gotten drunk. And then he'd had a fight with Dad, and he came back to the detention centre on Monday, and he said to me, well, I've got an appointment later today with my drug and alcohol therapist. I realised I've got a bit more work to do there, and Dad's coming in on Thursday for some family therapy so we can work through what happened. So it's about knowing that, right, failure happens, we're here, we're a supportive group of people, these things will happen, but you're still working through it. It's okay that that happened, and by the time he finally gets out, there'll be that level of confidence that he's got the skills to work through those things without the centre and the staff. Last month I was lucky enough to be able to go to Canberra and advocate to parliamentarians about increasing leaves of absence. We are pretty limited in how much we use those here in Australia because of a perceived risk, but actually the overall risk to the community is much, much lower when you've got young people who are prepared and connected to their communities, especially if they can do things like rejoining school or starting a job and being in the habit of going to that job every day before they're actually released from youth detention. And meaningful activities, so the picture on the right, so the middle picture there was the highest security youth detention centre in Denmark. It's in Copenhagen, where young people were using silver cutlery. You know, there's a very different way of risk assessment when you've got things that young people really want. I actually sat down at lunch with a young man who had just come off an on-site kind of building. He was doing a construction course. He was building something in the detention centre, and he had this massive Stanley knife, and he put it in his pocket and he sat down next to me. This is a young person in a maximum security detention centre. And I said to him, is it okay if I ask you why? You know, I said, did you ever use violence in the community before you came in here? And he said, yep. And I said, well, why are you able to have a knife in your pocket now? And why are you not thinking about using it for violence? And he said, oh, because this guy that's teaching me this skill, he's talking about employing me when I get out, and next week I get to go out and interview for that job, and like, why would I screw that up? Yeah, and the one on the right there is a picture of a Diagrama centre in Spain. You can see a big high fence behind it, but that orange building was built by young people. All of the gardening was done by young people. It's a meaningful way to spend your time. They're very busy. They're not just learning bricklaying, building a big brick wall to knock it down, get the certificate, move on, build it up again. They're building that brick wall so they can sit around it around the fire that night. You know, they're really engaged in meaningful activity. And that centre there was probably one of the ugliest buildings I've ever seen a youth detention centre look like. That, not the orange building, but behind it where the young people were accommodated, it used to be a high security men's prison. But as soon as the Diagrama model moved in, it's about the model. They've created it and they've made it their own, and they've made it as beautiful as they can. So the other set of elements I think that we can learn from are the external things. Families are front and centre at every successful youth detention model that I saw. There is nothing without family, and a lot of that is facilitated by having young people located close to their families and their communities. And I don't necessarily just mean the biological family members that young person was born into, but having a group of adults that a young person can rely on, a group of people that are part of their lives forever, and not just because they're kind of being paid to be around. Strengthening family relationships through counselling, bringing families along for the journey, introducing young people to other people that can be in their lives, whether that's a coach or a mentor or an employer. It's building that network for the young person while they're in there. So I saw in Spain, again, there was a family therapy group. So for 10 months, a group of families had come together every month, and they'd been studying modules like the impact of trauma on the teenage brain. Side by side, that group of young people had been doing some work as a group, and then also they were having individual family therapy sessions in between to work through those relationships. And by the time that 10-month period was over, the families were gathering, they were wearing costumes. You could see that the relationships and the trust had been built over that 10-month period, and you could just feel how those families were kind of ready and prepared for their young people to come back and be part of their families again. The picture in the middle is in New York City. So as I said, young people were moved out of big youth detention centres and into houses and homes. The one on the right is an example of that. It's in Brooklyn. If you drive past that house, it just looks like a house, but there are locks on the doors and windows. But in the middle there, it's actually a school where young people from the houses around New York City get on buses and get in cars, and they come to this academy, this school in New York City every day, and they get educated there. So when that school opened as a school for young people in youth detention, the community was so outraged that they threw rocks at the building, teachers were injured, they protested. They were really, really angry, not on my street, we don't want those kids here. So this academy did a really targeted community engagement, initiative. They had the young people go out and do community service work, both on the streets but also for community agencies. They attended meetings, they went to They went out and about, but they also invited the community in. So they had any young person who didn't have a family member come and visit them. They invited them to come to the school and be their visitor. They had local quilting groups and a pipe band, and they had like art exhibitions. And once a week you could come in and sit down at a table and eat a meal with a young person, and the young person had cooked that meal and they would sit and talk about their lives. The same thing happened in Missouri and in Denmark and in Spain. It was about this concept that these are our kids, they're your kids, they're from your community, they're coming back to your community. Do you want them to be better when they come out? And all of this beautiful stuff emerged around young people creating connections with people who would in the future become part of their life ongoing. And finally, a service system. So I think what we struggle with here is often this concept that young people are either locked up or completely free to do what they want. And nobody's really comfortable with either choice, right? So the service system, I mean, I saw places where young people who only sexually offended were living. I saw places for young people who had only offended against their family members, places for young people who had neurodiversity, mental health concerns, drug and alcohol issues, very, very low security homes where every young person in the detention centre left and went to mainstream school every day of the week without staff and then came back to the detention centre. Higher security places where young people were still earning the right then to move into a lower security place. We actually need a really diverse service system so that we're not just having one size fits all great big mega centres that we just put all the young people in and expect them to get better. So that's it from me, but please reach out. I'm going to send these slides around if you'd like to talk more to me about any of that. Thank you.